Welcome to What Would Alan Say? A podcast discussing a variety of topics, including current events and personal or social issues through the lens of Alan Watts' philosophy and life's work. I'm your host, Nathan, and I will be sharing some of my own opinions and analysis on these topics, and to the best of my ability, my knowledge about what Alan specifically did say, or theoretically would say, based on his own ideas, personality, and values. I highly encourage you to read, watch, and listen to Alan Watts for yourself, and discover the knowledge and wisdom he imparted during his lifetime. Visit alanwatts.org for a complete list of his books, articles, and audio or visual lectures. I sincerely hope that you will enjoy listening to this podcast, develop a curiosity for and appreciation of Alan Watts, and learn even more about the topics and ideas presented here. All right, so now that we've had that warning, what are the 3 questions that I want to ask you, the audience, or oneself if you are trying to move forward with a goal or a process of improving yourself? So the first question would be, what do you desire? Specifically, what do you desire to change or improve? And of course, how do you define improvement or positive change? And these 3 questions are basically all related to asking what we desire. So for example, by asking these questions, it's similar to when people ask, well, what are your values? Let's start with that. How do you define improvement or positive change? Because that can mean something different to each person. And so we have to make sure that our intentions and our desires and our values are basically in alignment, but in a way, all of those things are the same thing, essentially, or they're completely interrelated. So, for example, in one of his lectures, when discussing why someone doesn't know what they desire, he said, quote, 2 reasons. Number 1, you have it. Number 2, you don't know yourself because you never can. The Godhead is never an object of its own knowledge. Just as a knife doesn't cut itself, fire doesn't burn itself, light doesn't illuminate itself. It's always an endless mystery to itself. I don't know. And this I don't know, uttered in the infinite interior of the Spirit, is the same thing as I love, I let go. I don't try to force or control. It's the same thing as humility, end quote. So you see, there's the hang-up or the problem again. We are a mystery to ourselves, so how can we successfully pick ourselves apart in an effort to change or to plan and control the direction of this change? And yet, we do change, and we need to change at the very least in the sense of furthering our own survival. For example, people hit rock bottom, as we've all probably heard examples and seen, or maybe you've personally experienced. And then people turn their whole lives around, so to speak. And how does that happen? Well, that leads us to our second question. What's the best, meaning practical and effective, method to use? Which, for the self-improvement or self-help industry, that's kind of the golden question, right? The thing that everyone is trying to sell you, and the thing that everyone is hypothetically asking and then trying to argue they have the best method. But what would Alan say if we are to use any method versus another? Well, he would say the method we could use is Wu Wei, the way of nature, in accordance with a concept called the Tao. For those of you who aren't familiar with Taoism, let me briefly explain what it is so this makes sense. The Tao is a word which can be translated as the way, and is a concept intended to represent the most fundamental truth of reality. It's often represented by the Chinese yin-yang symbol, pronounced yin-yang in English, which is not actually Taoist in origin, but was later integrated into this philosophical tradition. So what is the most basic fundamental truth of reality, of the universe? Well, it's extremely difficult to say what it is because the Tao is non-dualistic. That's why when Taoist philosophers illustrate the concept through the limitation of words, they usually do so by describing what it is not. So one of the closest ways we can assertively or positively describe the Tao using language is to say it is not dualistic or non-dual. And Wu Wei within Taoism is a method, or we could even just say a reality within that philosophy, about taking the line of least resistance, like I said, non-effort, non-trying, doing non-doing, doing not doing, as some people have said. But this is not a gimmick. So we have this non-effort, non-doing, non-trying, which sounds so wonderful and easy. And like, oh, you can snap your fingers, right? But it's actually not that. It's not a gimmick. It's not a means of control. It's the opposite of that. It's like letting go of control. But you can't control letting go of control. You can't basically decide to let go of control. You can't dictate when this happens, which brings us back to that example, the warning of earlier, which is as soon as you set an intention, as soon as a desire arises, then you are announcing to the world, to the thing you're trying to change, to yourself, really. You're announcing to yourself, oh, I'm going to drop everything and I'm going to be spontaneous. But that's basically trying to be spontaneous. Like, you can't plan to be spontaneous. You can't plan and make an effort to not make plans and not make an effort and do things the easy way, if that's how you want to think of it. Like, that's not really natural. It just puts us in a double mind or a hang-up or creates psychic tension, all of these different terms that Alan Watts uses. So, this method's not a gimmick. We can't force, or in other words, make an effort to be non-effortful, non-resistant, accepting, and so forth. As soon as we do this, we are caught in another example of the trap, or the hang-up. There you go. Oh, do you feel the psychic tension building up? Like, I hope you do, because that's kind of part of my intention. And that's something that you can only understand by experiencing it. So, man, we're getting into a big mess, right? Like, what do we do? What do we not do? How is any of this possible? So let me provide another example of a method Alan Watts may suggest, which again highlights this same problem. Let's consider the middle way of Buddhism. Quote, to try and solve the problem of suffering by immersing yourself in pleasure only leads to a hangover. To try and solve the problem by asceticism also brings no liberation. You merely get tied up in a kind of masochism, where you say, I know I'm right, just so long as I'm hurting. And all that is doing is kind of expiating your infantile guilt sense. So he said, there is a middle way between asceticism on the one hand and hedonism on the other. But actually, the middle way is more subtle than that. So most of that is Watts quoting the Buddha. And by the way, expiating, I had to look it up. It means atonement, amends, reparation for your infantile guilt sense. So, Watts goes on to describe a different philosopher illustrating this teaching of the Buddha with a dialogue, a hypothetical dialogue between a master and his disciple. The disciple tells his master that he is suffering because he desires. The master then says to the disciple to give up desiring. So the disciple goes away to meditate and try to give up desiring. Of course, he comes back and says something like, Master, I'm not very good at giving up desire, because when I try to do this, I find that I am desiring not to desire. The master then says, well, try not to desire to give up desiring. And so the story repeats this process, and you get the picture. We obviously can see how this leads the student down a rabbit hole, and could potentially be repeated over and over infinitely. There's no end to trying to use this method, this conscious, sort of independent, willful method of giving up desire. It's impossible. It just creates a feedback loop. If anything, it exacerbates the problem, if we can say a problem is there. But Alan Watts goes on to say that step by step, the student is being brought together with himself to the point that he is catching up with his own inner being and can accept himself completely. End quote. So basically, this brings us to another point Alan Watts often makes, which is to say that if you define yourself as having a problem, you are in need of help and in need of solving it. So if you say you need to speak to a psychiatrist, you ought to have your head examined, is something that he said many times. Now, I just want to note that when he said this, he would actually say it very humorously and affectionately to point out that the person is defining themselves as having a problem, not to shame people for seeing a psychiatrist or therapist. Another example he gave was when he said, if you believe you need to practice Buddhism, then you ought to have your head smacked. He's referring to a common practice in Zen of tapping or hitting a person's head and shoulders to bring their attention back to meditation. Lastly, Alan Watts says, if you look upon Zen as something to be applied in a do-it-yourself, self-help way to improve your life, you see, that's asking the wrong question. That's not it. You see, it's just because one is looking all the time to improve it, to be other than where you are, to get something out of life as if it were different from you. That's what makes the trouble. So, in this other example of the middle way and desiring not to desire, what we see is that whether we like it or not, and without any intention or effort, think about it. This is what's interesting. Without even trying, we inevitably do what? We build up psychic tension. We become more and more serious and wrapped up and entangled with our, quote, problems until what? Until we let go. Until the tension becomes so intense that we let go. And we don't choose to let go, it just happens. And when we let go, what we're basically realizing, feeling, perceiving is that there is no problem. There is no problem. The third and final question: what happens when we finally do improve and change? So, whether this is because of the process that I just outlined, which is completely spontaneous, or through another process, which we could say doesn't feel spontaneous, though I would make the argument, and so would Alan Watts, that everything we do is spontaneous, whether we like it or not, whether we understand it or not, or feel it. But what happens when we finally do improve and change? So what is the result? Is this what we desired? Going back to the first question, did we even have a good understanding of what we desire in the first place? But even if we thought we did, when we finally get what we want, is this still true? Is this actually what we desired? Did our effort to improve and change things result in a, quote, positive change? Or were there unintended consequences? So that's another consideration within this question of what happens when we do improve and change. So one thing that Alan Watts would say is the road to hell is paved with good intentions, which he's not the original source of that saying, obviously, but it's something he emphasized a lot, particularly when we consider the principles and values of non-intention or non-effort that we discussed earlier. You can see how we can get really, really mixed up in all of this. And people can have good intentions to change and improve, but this can cause a lot of problems, especially when we think about going back to the very beginning of this discussion. Well, who's the person or entity that is doing the changing? You might just be deceiving yourself because you haven't integrated the shadow or the devil or the rascal and so forth within you. And you don't realize that actually your ego, there's another word for that, it's your ego that is in control and trying to do all of the changing and, quote, improving. And so what often happens is that people have good intentions, or they think they have good intentions, but actually it's their ego, like running the whole show, just up another level, kind of like a burglar who goes up to another level in the house, or that fugitive that we're looking for who runs away because we've been beating the drum and announcing our efforts to become a good person, or to do something good, or to become enlightened, or to, do God's will, however you want to put it. That's what often happens, right? Or that's what can happen. We can at least say that. That's what can happen. So the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Alan Watts would also discuss a particular parable, a Chinese parable, that he often used to illustrate some of his points. The parable is called Sai Wong Shi Ma. Sai Wong means both old man, it seems, and also possibly the name of the individual. So you can think of it as the person Sai Wong, or just old man. And then Shi Ma means loses horse, or horse loses. So basically, old man loses horse is the name of the parable. Interestingly, in Google Translate, I noticed when I was listening to the pronunciation, the whole thing put together was translated as blessing in disguise. So maybe that's more of the general usage of this parable or way of thinking about it. So what is the parable? Basically, there's a man who has a horse, and one day his horse runs away. And so all the villagers come to him and say, "Oh, that's so terrible. What bad fortune. We are so sorry for you," etc., etc. And the old man basically says, maybe. Like, maybe it's bad. We'll see. Or in other versions, he says, "How do I know whether this is not a blessing in disguise, or how do I know whether this is not a good thing?" And so a few days later, the horse returns with a mare, with another horse, a female horse. And now he has two horses, and the villagers return and are like, "Yay, hurrah, you're so fortunate. Congratulations, how lucky you are." And again, he says, maybe. Or, "How do I know if this is ultimately a bad thing?" Then his son is riding the new mare one day, trying to perhaps tame or break in the horse. And it's a very spirited horse, more than usual, and it throws him and he breaks his leg. And so the villagers return, and again they're like, "Oh, this is so terrible, we're so sorry." And he says, maybe. And then one day soldiers come to the village looking for young men to conscript for the war. This parable actually takes place during the Warring States period. So there's a lot of fighting and wars going on, and the soldiers come and they're looking for young men to take away and forced to fight in the wars. And of course, the young man doesn't get conscripted. The old man's son doesn't get conscripted because of his broken leg. So the townspeople come back one more time and say, "How fortunate, how lucky you are. This all turned out for the best." And the parable ends with the old man saying, maybe. We'll see, right? So that's the parable of the old man loses horse. And this points to the uncertainty of the, quote, ultimate nature of good and bad circumstances, because in reality, nature is always changing. The maybe subjectiveness of good and bad is apparent, but if we can say there's an objective reality to it, then that reality is often changing, and it's certainly something that we as human beings cannot foresee and actually understand or wrap our minds around. So in the context again of maybe self-improvement or intentional change within one's life, this is an important question to ask us is, well, what happens when we do improve or when we do change? Was this for the best or, quote, the worst? Is this good or bad now and later? We don't really know. Here are some concluding thoughts, and I want to leave you with some encouragement, despite maybe the angst and psychic tension that has been built up, or perhaps you're feeling kind of discouraged when you think about your previous or current mindset about trying to change yourself. But I hope these 3 questions are very useful for reflecting on your personal life and to apply to whatever ideas you have about self-improvement or that you might be presented with by other people. And we can talk about those specific ideas more next time. But I just want to say, enjoy yourself. Please don't feel offended, self-conscious, or ashamed about trying to improve yourself, about making an effort to change. And also, if you do feel that way, you don't need to feel ashamed or self-conscious about being self-conscious or ashamed. What Alan Watts would say about all of this is that ultimately, whether you are, quote, far in or far out, meaning a square or circle type of person, in the context of his philosophy, you are manifesting yourself brilliantly regardless. And the world actually needs people like you too. So the world needs people who are trying to improve themselves. The world needs people who are kind of caught up in this trap or this hang-up, as we've said before. In fact, we could say subjectively, your personal life, you need to, in a sense, feel that, experience that, be or manifest that at various points in your life. And that's really all part of one big process. That's all the Tao. If we go back to some points earlier, this is all the way of nature. It's all a big happening in his philosophy. So, you don't need to improve yourself, for example, by trying not to improve yourself, or by desiring not to desire to improve yourself. If you start to have those thoughts and kind of slip into that, that's okay too. Don't resist it. But just want to point that out, right? It's not necessary. That's not the point here. You really don't need to, for example, forcefully adopt as much of a minimalist or maybe carefree attitude as possible, which maybe some of you have noticed is also a different example of attempting self-improvement that some people advocate. And really it leads us right back to the same hang-up. So for now, let's just say it's all good. Just keep up the good work and you do you. And next time, we will talk about the self-help movement as a whole. I'd like to conclude with one last quote from Alan Watts. Quote, "I won't wake up until I feel I deserve it. I won't wake up until I've made it difficult for me to wake up. So I invent for myself an elaborate system of delaying my waking up. I put myself through this test and that test, and when I feel it's been sufficiently arduous, then I may at last admit to myself who I really am, and draw aside the veil, and realize that after all is said and done, I am that I am, which is the name of God. And when it comes to it, that's really rather funny. They say in Zen, when you attain Satori, nothing is left to you at that moment but to have a good laugh." Thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like the video, share my work with other people, and consider subscribing to my content or making a donation to support me. And please, please leave comments or message me if you felt inspired and want to share and discuss something or ask any thoughtful questions. With much love and compassion. Arigato, everyone. Ciao!